Good evening. Over the last few weeks, India has witnessed intense protests surrounding the NEET paper leaks, issues with the CBSE Class 12 evaluation, and a demand for the Education Minister's resignation. The anger among students and parents was real. The government responded with a series of steps. Number one, expert committees. Number two, biometric checks. Number three, better monitoring of centers. Number four, cancellation and retest of a compromised examination. Number five, reduced fees. Number six, the announcement of fast-track courts. And eventually, number seven, the resignation of Dharmendra Pradhan. Some people are calling the resignation a victory. Others are calling it a surrender. Very few are asking the more important questions. First of all, what exactly are the loopholes in India's examination system that make a single paper leak so devastating? Secondly, which of the government's measures actually address those loopholes and which ones fall short? And finally, what role do national politics and certain international interests play in demanding the maximum regime change rather than pressuring the government to reform the system? Was Dharmendra Pradhan a mere excuse and Narendra Modi the real target? Heard of the take no prisoners policy in warfare? I'll come to that later. Stay with me till the end. I wish to address the technicalities carefully today, not as slogans, but as practical issues that affect the futures of millions of young Indians. The political part will come in the end. It may be the juiciest part for some of you, but don't just skip to the last chapter because it will make complete sense to you only if you have not missed the build up to that climax. In the course of this podcast, you may see me in different outfits because I'm not shooting the whole thing together. What matters to me more than a continuously constant look is the accuracy of the information I share with you. For that, and honestly speaking, I have prepared so long a script that it cannot be shot in one sitting. So, here we go. Places like Kota and Sikar, it is common for families to sell land, take education loans, or even move the entire household so that their child can attend coaching for 12 to 14 hours a day. GST collections from coaching services rose from 2,240 crore rupees in 2019-20 to 5,517 crore rupees in 2023-24. Almost 150% increase in 4 years. Mathematics curriculum was to introduce the Shulba Sutras, the ancient Indian texts that contain sophisticated geometric knowledge. The history curriculum was to move away from the older Aryan invasion or Aryan migration framework and place the Sindhu-Saraswati civilization at the center of the story. In plain terms, Indian students would finally be taught. The CJP Instagram handle crossed 10 million followers within days and at points surpassed the official handles of both the BJP and the Congress. Fourth, Sonam Wangchuk, an engineer and educationist with an impressive record of awards and foreign recognition. In Bangladesh in 2024, student protests over a job quota system escalated rapidly and ended with the ouster of Sheikh Hasina. It unnerved organizations and individuals who had grown accustomed to a more permissive environment for foreign funds. When a government begins to examine the money trail with greater intent, those who rely on that money and those outside the country who supply it feel the pressure.
The timing of the recent agitation coincided with the period when the FCRA amendment bill was the choice between those born in the 21st century, whom Americans refer to as Gen Z and Gen Alpha, remains the same. Whether its energy will be used to widen the gate of opportunity or whether it will once again be channeled into changing the faces that guard a gate that stays narrow.
Good evening. Over the last few weeks, India has seen some intense protests over the NEET paper leaks and the problems that arose in the CBSE Class 12 evaluation. Students and parents felt their futures had been put at serious risk. The government responded with several steps, including the resignation of then Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan and the passage of a tougher anti-paper leak law in the Lok Sabha. Well, some call this a victory while others call it a surrender, but very few are examining why a paper leak today causes far more damage than it did, say, 15 or 20 years ago. Suppose you ask why a single leaked paper now triggers such widespread panic. The core reason is scarcity. More than 20 lakh students appear for NEET every year. Even after the expansion of medical seats in the last decade, the number of good government seats remains far smaller. In practical terms, a difference of just 4 or 5 marks can decide whether a student gets a subsidized seat or is forced into a private college where the fees run into several tens of lakhs. Most of these students have already spent 2 or 3 years preparing. For places like Kota and Sikar, it is common for families to sell land, take education loans, or even move the entire household so that their child can attend coaching for 12 to 14 hours a day. When the paper is compromised, that entire investment of the family's time, money, and hope suddenly looks wasted. That is why the reaction is so intense. There is a related design issue that needs careful distinction, of course. I do not believe a centralized examination process is necessarily bad. In fact, India's pre-NEET years were often worse. Different states and universities had widely varying standards. And the quality of a medical graduate, for example, could differ sharply depending on where he or she had studied. And then there was state-level corruption. We need one common yardstick. A bridge built by an engineer from Punjab, for example, should be as robust as one built by an engineer from Bihar. A cardiac patient in Jaipur, likewise, should feel as safe with a cardiologist trained in Agartala as with one trained in any other city. Without a single rigorous national measure of competence, that assurance disappears. Advanced countries, in fact, follow a similar logic. The United States has, for example, centralized checkpoints such as the high school diploma and various standardized tests. The United Kingdom has the GCSE and A levels. At the same time, neither country runs schools through a single central board unlike us. Schools remain under the jurisdiction of states in the US and local authorities in the UK. This is the distinction that matters. Education and training should be decentralized so that students are exposed to different styles of teaching and problem solving. As someone who studied under the CBSE, then at the University of Calcutta, and finally at the University of Glasgow, I saw firsthand how students from different systems approached a given problem in different ways. That variety is healthy. It allows us to discover what works. But the final measurement of competence, the output, needs to be common and rigorous. The real practical problem arises when that single yardstick becomes an extremely narrow gate because of severe scarcity of seats. That is what turns every leak into a national crisis. The examination itself is not the villain. The combination of one high-stakes national test with far too few good seats is what creates the pressure cooker. Now suppose you ask what the government has actually done in response. After the 2024 controversy, it set up a high-level committee under former ISRO chief K. Radhakrishnan. Many of its recommendations were implemented. Aadhaar-based biometric checks so that the person in the examination hall is the same person who registered. Expanded CCTV coverage, mobile jammers, a sharp increase in the share of government-run exam centers to more than 99%, and finally, state and district coordination committees were activated. When fresh leaks appeared this year, the examination was cancelled and a full retest was ordered. After the CBSE on-screen marking failures, leadership changes were made. Fees for obtaining answer sheets and for re-evaluation were reduced, and technical help was taken from the IITs. Most recently, the Lok Sabha passed the Public Examinations Prevention of Unfair Means Amendment Bill 2026. It raises the punishment for individuals involved in paper leaks to 5 to 10 years in jail and a fine of up to 50 lakh rupees. For organized rackets, the minimum imprisonment is 7 years and the fine can reach 10 crore rupees. Investigations must be completed within 2 months and trials in special fast-track courts within 3 months of the charge sheet. These steps raise the risk and the cost for those who organize leaks. Biometric authentication and better monitoring close some of the easier routes for malpractice. The new law adds real legal teeth and tries to ensure cases do not drag on for years. In that limited sense, they help. Yet, they leave the deeper scarcity of seats untouched. As long as the number of good opportunities remains far smaller than the number of serious aspirants, the pressure that turns a single national examination into a life-altering bottleneck will continue. The common yardstick is necessary. Turning that yardstick into the only extremely narrow gate is what creates the recurring crises. That is the starting point. We need a rigorous common measure of competence. We also need far more high-quality seats and pathways so that the measure does not become a desperate high-stakes lottery. The recent administrative and legal steps address specific vulnerabilities in the conduct of the examination. They do not, however, solve the scarcity that makes every failure feel catastrophic. A question that arises from what I just said is this: If the real problem is the extreme scarcity of good seats, why has private coaching become such a massive industry? Let me be clear about my own position first. I am not against private coaching. In fact, I swim against the popular tide on this issue. Competition among private tutors and coaching centers forces them to keep improving their teaching methods and results. If one center fails to deliver, parents and students simply move to another. That pressure often produces sharper pedagogy than what many regular schools offer. In many schools, teachers have fixed salaries and limited performance pressure. A good number of them are women whose primary responsibility is their own family. They must be back home by 2 or 3 p.m. to take care of their own children. The job is secondary. In such a setting, it is easier to take students for granted. Private coaching, for all its faults, does not have that luxury. Survival depends on results. The scale of this industry is now very large. Current estimates put it between 50,000 crore rupees and 70,000 crore rupees. GST collections from coaching services rose from 2,240 crore rupees in 2019-20 to 5,517 crore rupees in 2023-24, almost 150% increase in 4 years. At its peak, Kota alone attracted more than 2 lakh students every year. Even after a decline, the city still hosts well over 1 lakh students, and recent reports speak of a 20 to 25% recovery in admissions. Several million students across the country are enrolled in some form of coaching for NEET, JEE, UPSC, and other competitive exams. For many families, the annual cost, tuition, hostel, food runs into several lakhs of rupees. This industry did not grow in a vacuum. It grew because the number of good seats is far smaller than the number of serious aspirants. When the official path is so narrow, families treat coaching as the only realistic route to a secure future. The anxiety itself becomes a market. But then, what about the darker side? When the financial and emotional stakes become this high, the incentive to game the system also grows. It is rather like allowing betting on cricket matches while trying to prevent match fixing. As long as the money involved is large, someone will try to fix the outcome. Organized paper leak rackets, solver gangs, and middlemen thrive precisely because the rewards are so substantial. The same scarcity that drives legitimate coaching also creates the black market. You may now ask how the government's recent measures affect these incentives. The biometric checks, the higher share of government exam centers, the better monitoring, and especially the new anti-cheating bill passed in the Lok Sabha changed the risk calculation. An individual involved in a leak now faces 5 to 10 years in jail and a fine of up to 50 lakh rupees. Organized rackets face a minimum of 7 years and fines that can reach 10 crore rupees. Investigations are supposed to finish in 2 months and trials in 3. These provisions raise the personal and financial cost of malpractice. They make large-scale leaks harder and more dangerous than before. Yet, they do not reduce the underlying scarcity that keeps both the legitimate coaching industry and the black market so large. The pressure remains. A further question follows. Why did so much of the public and political energy stay fixed on the demand that the education minister must resign? A paper leak is concrete and it drives emotions wild. It is easy to turn into a sharp political slogan. Once the demand becomes resign or continue the pressure, the more difficult discussion about scarcity of seats and the commercial incentives that grow around it receives far less attention. The political outcome is achieved, the structural pressure cooker remains largely intact. That is the next layer. Competitive private coaching is not the villain. Extreme scarcity is. The recent legal and administrative steps raise the cost of cheating. They still leave the demand that fuels both the coaching industry and the black market largely untouched. Now, do certain external interests prefer the Indian examination system to remain fragile? The answer becomes clearer when we look at the reforms that were under discussion in the middle of this year. Also look at who stood to lose if those reforms took root. And here I must tell you something important. India's education is the least of their concerns. It is a red herring, a distraction. If I said in the introduction that I would keep the political part for the end, I meant geopolitics. The politics over education follows right here in this chapter. Keep watching as I peel every layer of this onion. In the politics over education, three decisions were sitting on the table at the same time. First, the new NCERT textbooks for classes 9 to 12. The mathematics curriculum was to introduce the Shulba Sutras, the ancient Indian texts that contain sophisticated geometric knowledge. The history curriculum was to move away from the older Aryan invasion or Aryan migration framework and place the Sindhu-Saraswati civilization at the center of the story. In plain terms, Indian students would finally be taught that complex mathematics and urban civilization developed here on this soil, Indian soil. Here is a further complication that arises, of course, directly from the proposed change in the history curriculum. And this is technical. For more than 3 decades, the Aryan invasion or Aryan migration theory has been hotly debated inside India. Many Western academic institutions, however, remain largely committed to the idea that the Indo-Aryan language and associated cultural elements entered the subcontinent from Central Asia. Some Indian scholars have long argued that the theory was shaped in the colonial period, pointing to figures such as Max Muller, a German scholar employed by the British, and suggesting it served to portray Indians as outsiders in their own land. They did this to blunt and preempt future attacks from freedom fighters right after the revolt of 1857 by sending to India a band of bureaucrats who masqueraded as historians. Mainstream Western historians counter that the theory is now supported by genetic studies. We in turn question
whether historians, arts graduates, are equipped to interpret genetic data in the first place. Beyond the debate itself, basic questions remain unanswered. If the ancestors of Indians came from Central Asia, why do the school curricula of Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, or Turkmenistan not claim that Indians originated in their territories? That Sanskrit was once their language? Or that the Vedas and early Hindu traditions belong to them? Why, biologically, do most Indians not resemble Uzbeks or Tajiks? You know, that typical Mongoloid look you see in the portraits of Babur? If 30% of our genes come from the steppes, shouldn't our appearance resemble that of the people who inhabit those grasslands? It is entirely possible that in an ancient world, without passports, visas, or fixed borders, groups moved in both directions, into and out of the northwestern part of the subcontinent, according to climate change, rainfall or drought, economic opportunity, etc. Even the frequently cited Mitanni evidence from the 14th century BCE, which with names that sound like Indra, Varuna, etc., and technical terms related to horses, is open to question. The same word can carry entirely different meanings in different languages. Just as gift, G-I-F-T, means something quite different in English and in German. Or as the names Seema and Uday have completely unrelated etymologies and senses in Sanskrit and in Arabic. I'm not asking you to settle the Aryan debate here. What matters for our present discussion is the practical consequence. If Indian school and undergraduate history teaching moves decisively away from the frameworks still dominant in many Western universities, those universities may begin to treat Indian applicants for BA and MA programs in history as academically underprepared or as products of a non-standard curriculum. That would create a technical barrier to admission and credit recognition, an academic and bureaucratic friction between two systems of knowledge, rather than a purely political quarrel. These academic frictions are real, and they may create practical difficulties for Indian students of history abroad. But they cannot be what primarily drove the protests we have been discussing. So let us return to the central question of who benefits when the Indian examination system remains high stakes and fragile. Second, the CBSE curricula making 3 languages mandatory from class 9, with at least 2 of them Indian languages, may be an issue for the protesters. This begins to loosen the exclusive hold of English on high-stakes examination success. Some of you may say that no external force could possibly care whether Indian children learn in English or in an Indian language, that this is purely domestic politics. Hear me out. I will show you shortly how certain external interests do have reasons to object both to the reformed curricula and to the language in which that education is delivered. The full geopolitical picture is the juiciest part, as I keep telling you, and it's coming in the end. But if you skip ahead, you will not see how I reached that conclusion. So patience. Stay with the gradual build-up. Third, the measures recommended by the Radhakrishnan Committee for the National Testing Agency. Greater decentralization and a technology architecture that does not depend on a single vulnerable point, no single printer, no single strong room, no single group of officials whose compromise can bring down an entire national examination. The question that arises is simple. Who loses if these 3 changes become permanent? Start with the academic networks outside India that have built entire careers and departments around the older historical frameworks. Significant research grants are linked to those frameworks. When the story taught inside India changes, the demand for those external interpretations begins to shrink. Next, look at the foreign universities in the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia. Together, they earn several $billion every year from Indian students. A good part of that flow rests on the belief that an Indian degree or an Indian medical seat is still second best. If India restores confidence in its own curriculum, its own languages, and its own examination systems, some of that outflow will slow down. Then comes the coaching industry itself, including the global investors who have poured large sums into platforms and classroom businesses that thrive on the present level of anxiety. Decentralization and a greater weight for Indian languages may not destroy that industry overnight, but they will change its economics. The pure scarcity model becomes less profitable. Fourthly and finally, there is the broader activist and funding ecosystem that has long depended on a narrative of Indian intellectual dependence. Teach children their own civilizational achievements with confidence, and that narrative loses oxygen. Funding follows narratives. When the narrative weakens, the funding eventually weakens too. Add these together, and you are looking at very large commercial and institutional interests that prefer the present arrangement to remain high stakes and somewhat fragile. This was not a conspiracy theory. It is simply an accounting of who benefits from the status quo. A further question follows. Is there also a longer geopolitical pattern at work? For more than a decade, I have pointed out through my articles that the permanent apparatus in the United States, centered in the Pentagon and working through various intelligence and funding channels, has a clear preference for keeping rising countries' economies in a state of managed instability. It does not always need a full change of government, regime change. Sometimes a continuous series of crises, each one consuming political capital and forcing the leadership of this country to play defense, is enough. Student anger over examinations is a particularly useful instrument because it is real, it is emotional, and it can be amplified very quickly. Organizations that present themselves as philanthropic have sometimes served as convenient channels. The Ford Foundation is one name that has appeared repeatedly in discussions of such networks inside India. The pattern is consistent. When a government begins to reduce external leverage, whether in governance, in textbooks, in language policy, examination security, or rules on foreign funding, resistance often takes the form of youth mobilization. The grievances may be genuine. The way they are organized and directed frequently follows a recognizable script. Look at the sequence we have just lived through. Real failures in the examination system produced real distress. That distress was rapidly organized into a single demand: the education minister must resign. Concrete measures, biometric checks, better monitoring, leadership changes, cancellation and retest, fee reductions, the Prime Minister's announcement of fast-track courts, etc., received far less attention than the demand for a political scalp. When the scalp was finally delivered, Sections of the commentariat framed it as capitulation. What they carefully did not emphasize is how little of the larger reform agenda had actually been surrendered. Even some BJP supporters are sad that the government surrendered. But did it? A minister has gone. The effort to reduce single points of failure, to strengthen security protocols, to move towards computer-based testing, and to proceed with curriculum and language changes has not been abandoned. This is a personnel adjustment, not regime change. It is not even a clear policy reversal. In the calculus of those who prefer managed instability, it is a limited success at best. The government has been forced to spend political capital. What it has not done is abandon the longer-term project of making Indian education less fragile and less dependent on external frameworks. The question that arises from all this is straightforward. Does replacing one minister solve the structural mess? No. The extreme scarcity of good seats, the commercial incentives that profit from anxiety, and the political usefulness of student unrest all remain. The measures that actually address those vulnerabilities, the technology, the decentralization, the courts, the curriculum, are still the ones that matter. The resignation meets a political demand. It does not, by itself, close the loopholes. That is why the focus must now shift from the individual who has left to whether the practical steps that reduce vulnerability are actually being carried through and strengthened. The resignation of the education minister met the most visible demand of the protesters. Yet, several features of this agitation set it apart from earlier student or anti-corruption movements, and they deserve closer examination. First, the language. The cockroach Jantar Party activists frequently used highly abusive and offensive ruffian-like language in public. This was not the usual heated slogan shouting of Indian street protests. The leftist section of the mainstream media defended it, saying such language is common these days. But street language has always been rough. What was new was the readiness of some seasoned journalists to treat that language as acceptable in organized political discourse. They even passed off women activists approaching their 30s as girls. The guilty media houses include the much venerated BBC, which has long been known to harbor nothing but contempt for patriotic Indians. Second, the visual and social composition. A noticeable section of the more aggressive protesters carried posters of B.R. Ambedkar. This indicated a significant Dalit presence. Contrast this with earlier upper caste-led protests, for example, those associated with influencer and journalist Ajit Bharti over the UGC equity guidelines. In that case, restrictions, including house arrest, were imposed relatively quickly. Scheduled castes and scheduled tribes form a more cohesive electoral bloc than the fragmented upper castes. Governments of every color have historically been more cautious when protests visibly draw from the SC/ST crowd. Third, the speed and scale of online growth. The CJP Instagram handle crossed 10 million followers within days and at points surpassed the official handles of both the BJP and the Congress. Abhijit Dipke, a 30-year-old who studied public relations at Boston University and had earlier worked with the Aam Aadmi Party, their social media team, was identified as a key founder. Early in the agitation, again, pro-government social media users and independent commentators began circulating information about these links and about the personal backgrounds of some of the organizers. Unlike the earlier careers of VP Singh or Arvind Kejriwal, the CJP faced public scrutiny of its key faces almost immediately. Yet, the government still conceded ground and asked Dharmendra Pradhan to step down. Fourth, Sonam Wangchuk. An engineer and educationist with an impressive record of awards and foreign recognition, he joined the protest and began an indefinite fast. After 26 days, he ended the fast following written assurances from the government. What assurances? No punitive actions against peaceful protesters and a commitment to discuss examination accountability in Parliament. The fast was broken in the pressure or in the presence of senior union ministers. High-profile activists with strong international profiles have, in the past, often prolonged confrontations. These are typically the kind of credentials the deep state looks for before investing in a new face and projecting him as a future messiah. In this case, the confrontation ended relatively quickly. Why? How come? Did the government see the pattern, sense the danger, and preempt it by striking a deal with him backstage? Fifth, the agitation did not wind down after the climax. Even after Pradhan resigned and the protesters were moved from Jantar Mantar, the CJP is showing little inclination to disperse. When questions were raised about similar examination problems in opposition-ruled states such as Punjab, Karnataka, and Jharkhand, these organizers of protests eventually expressed support, but the intensity and visibility of that support remained noticeably lower than the campaign focused on the center. Several of the more prominent faces of the CJP had earlier associations with the Aam Aadmi Party. This raises an obvious question. Were the movement's priorities still aligned with the political forces that had incubated some of its key organizers? One does not easily go against one's own masters, right? Sixth, questions about lifestyle and antecedents. Independent commentator Abhijit Iyer Mitra, in a podcast for the Sunday Guardian, raised specific queries about the living arrangements and income sources of CJP spokesperson Saurabh Das, including claims about a residence in a high-value locality of Delhi. These points were later amplified by several television channels. Similar questions were asked about funding and background in the case of other organizers. The government had easy access to this publicly circulating information. Yet it chose not to make it the centerpiece of its response and instead accepted the minister's resignation. Why? These features: 1, the nature of the language; 2, the social composition of the more assertive sections; 3, the extremely rapid online growth; 4, the early availability of background information on the organizers; 5, the handling of Sonam Wangchuk's fast; 6, the reluctance to demobilize after the main demand was met; and 7, the selective intensity towards opposition-ruled states distinguish this episode from the anti-Mandal agitation of the early 1990s and from the India Against Corruption movement that propelled Arvind Kejriwal. In previous movements, genuine public anger was converted into political capital for new or rising leaders. In this case, the conversion happened under conditions of unusually early public scrutiny of the organizers and a visible caste dimension that carried clear electoral weight. The government responded by sacrificing the minister while preserving the larger administrative and legal measures already underway. We cannot rule out the possibility that the forces behind the CJP uprising were larger than what met the eye. It is entirely possible that some of those forces were too big for even the Modi government to confront openly at that moment. So, it quietly wriggled out of the immediate corner, cleared the vicinity of Parliament of disruptive elements, and proceeded to pass important laws on examinations and on foreign-funded activity. Those laws have already been discussed earlier. Perhaps the Prime Minister will, at the right opportunity at an appropriate time, raise this pattern directly with his American counterpart. President Donald Trump has already acknowledged that USAID was used by the previous US administrations for regime change operations. A quiet conversation in the White House may one day be more effective than a public quarrel with those inside India who are not quite masters of their own will. That is where the present episode leaves us. The structural problems of scarcity and high-stakes examination design remain. The political energy of the moment was spent primarily on making a few expendable heads roll. The deeper questions about external influence and selective mobilization are still open. I said earlier that the juiciest part would come at the end. So let us look directly at the documented pattern of allegedly foreign-funded activism and then one specific Indian development that may explain the sense of urgency visible in the recent agitation. This is the final part of the explanatory podcast, and while it may be the juiciest for you, it is also one of the most complex. It deals with the history of the deep state's regime change operations that are officially recognized. So you can make complete sense of it, listen carefully. Across several continents, the US's disruptive methods have been remarkably consistent. In Chile, between 1970 and 73, declassified American documents and the Church Committee report of the US Senate show that President Richard Nixon ordered the CIA to prevent Salvador Allende from consolidating power. The instruction recorded by CIA Director Richard Helms was to make the economy scream. Millions of dollars was spent funding opposition groups, media, and strikes. Henry Kissinger later acknowledged that the United States worked to create the conditions for the 1973 military coup. Further back, in Iran in 1953, the CIA and British intelligence jointly ran Operation Ajax to remove Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, a fact later confirmed in official histories. In Guatemala in 1954 and Nicaragua in the 1980s, similar patterns of funding local opposition and applying economic pressure appear in the record. Closer in history, in Ukraine, in 2013-14, Victoria Nuland, then a senior US State Department official, publicly stated that her country had invested more than $5 billion since 1991 in building democratic institutions and civil society there. A leaked telephone call between Nuland and the American ambassador showed them discussing preferred opposition figures for a future government in Ukraine. Nuland herself visited the Maidan Nezhalezhnosti, translated into English as Independence Square, the central public square in Kyiv, Ukraine. Then, during the Arab Spring, genuine popular anger was real. Yet, American officials openly framed democracy promotion as a strategic instrument. In Libya, the United States and NATO provided military support that helped remove Muammar Gaddafi. The aftermath in several of these countries was prolonged instability rather than the stable democracy that had been promised. And it was expected. The United States rightly identified communism as its enemy during the Cold War. Since 9/11, the Muslim world seemed to have become its consciously identified target. At the same time, going by the admissions of America's retired detectives, communists and Muslims in democratic countries serve the United States' purpose of regime change operations as useful idiots. Now, if the ideologues of your country identify a group of people as civilization's enemy, and the administrators of the same country identify them as weapons against competing economies, the result is bound to be a mess. Thus, out of the countries that braved US military action, Afghanistan eventually went to the Taliban. The terrorist organization ISIS surfaced in Iraq and Syria, and post-Gaddafi Libya is just lost. Out of the countries that faced covert US operations, Imran Khan, who had repeatedly remarked that the US was interfering in matters of his country, against warnings from Pakistan's generals, mind you, is incarcerated. In Bangladesh in 2024, student protests over a job quota system escalated rapidly and ended with the ouster of Sheikh Hasina. Under Muhammad Yunus's interim government, the Bengali Muslim country was almost lost to Muslim fanatics who lynched minority Hindus until the BNP came to power and put a curb on the anarchists. Egypt has never quite regained its foothold after Hosni Mubarak was ousted through the Arab Spring. Tunisia has not been heard of since then. Whatever role Yugoslavia might have played geopolitically in the 20th century is now forgotten under the splinter countries that broke out of it. Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia, Serbia and Montenegro. Who cares what role these tiny countries play in the world anymore? What remains observable is the speed of the escalation and the international narrative support the agitations receive. The recurring elements are clear. Real local grievances, rapid organizational capacity building, sophisticated media amplification, a sharp personalized demand against a prominent leader, and external networks that supply resources, visibility, and diplomatic cover. It does not matter that the United States denies its recent and ongoing regime change operations. It officially denied any role in Bangladesh, for example. The pattern shows that people's suspicion today will eventually turn out to be facts tomorrow. Either from declassified files or from interviews of retired CIA officials. Now consider a development inside India that may have heightened the sense of urgency among some of these same networks. In a recent interview with Arnab Goswami, senior advocate and former Solicitor General Harish Salve discussed the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, the FCRA, and the amendments under government consideration right now. Salve's central point was simple: no donation comes free. Foreign money entering India is often intended to influence narratives, media coverage, corporate behavior, and sometimes social and religious agendas. The FCRA exists to ensure transparency about the source, purpose, and end use of that money. Comparable restrictions exist in many other countries, including the US. The 2010 version of the law was enacted by the UPA government. Tighter controls, including 5-year renewals, were added to the act soon thereafter. What changed after 2014 was the seriousness with which the rules began to be administered. Those who were too young in 2014-15 to have read the news back then may Google or use AI chatbots to learn that the Modi government had moved quite early to curb the sponsorships of the Ford Foundation, for example. The whole US administration, then headed by Barack Obama, panicked. An American delegation rushed to New Delhi to placate our new Prime Minister. Somehow, a compromise was reached, the details of which were never put in the public domain. However, all the beneficiaries of the foundation that I had named and detailed in my articles published in 2013-14 were thereafter no longer reported to be receiving those funds. Additionally, what the Modi government did was cancel registrations for non-compliance on a much larger scale. Reporting requirements were tightened, a new digital portal was introduced, and in the ongoing monsoon session of Parliament right now, further amendments were incorporated to close remaining loopholes. When this stricter enforcement was only rumored, it unnerved organizations and individuals who had grown accustomed to a more permissive environment for foreign funds. When a government begins to examine the money trail with greater intent, those who rely on that money and those outside the country who supply it feel the pressure. The timing of the recent agitation coincided with the period when the FCRA amendment bill was moving forward. The attempt to march towards the Parliament House occurred when important legislative business, including measures related to foreign funding, was on the agenda. It is therefore reasonable to ask whether part of the urgency and intensity visible in the protests stemmed from a calculation that the window for operating with less scrutiny was closing. A government that was prepared to tighten the rules on foreign money and to push through related legislation represented a more serious long-term threat to certain networks abroad than any single examination failure could. The deep state has failed to overthrow the Indian government once again, after the intolerance and mob lynching narratives or debates of 2015-16, the anti-CAA riots of 2019, sustained by the Shaheen Bagh blockade of 2019-20, and the rich farmers' protests in 2020-21. But a new organizational capacity among a section of the youth has been created. And the possibility of periodic explosions of anger of any section of Indian society or economy for whatever excuse remains. But for patriotic Indians, the foreign contribution regulation is in place. For the students and their parents who are right now interested only in the country's education system, the legislation on examination security is solid. That is the substantive point on which my explanation ends. But even as I was preparing for this podcast, Abhijit Iyer Mitra was revealing one dirty secret of the anti-India cartel after another. It was really not possible to include every related development in the script and keep delaying its production and release. Suffice to say that the structural bottleneck in higher education is still there. Meanwhile, its setbacks in India may make the deep state refine the methods by which it turns genuine grievances into instruments of political pressure. India's tightening of rules on foreign money has introduced a new variable that some of the older networks clearly find uncomfortable to operate with. The choice between those born in the 21st century, whom Americans refer to as Gen Z and Gen Alpha, remains the same. Whether its energy will be used to widen the gate of opportunity or whether it will once again be channeled into changing the faces that guard a gate that stays narrow. While the larger contest over who funds and directs political energy inside India continues among veteran political observers like my seniors, my peers, and me. Thank you for staying with this analysis until the end.